Sit tight and we'll get started in a moment. So for those who have just come into the room, thank you for joining us today. We're going to give another moment for people to get connected to audio and visual, so please just hold tight and we'll begin very shortly. All right, it looks like our flood of new arrivals into the chat room has ceased. So I'm going to go ahead and provide some very brief opening remarks. So good morning or good evening, based on where all of you are calling from. I'm very happy to welcome you to today's session on the future of the U.S.-Philippines alliance. My name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm a research analyst with the Stimson Center, and I just want to provide a few brief logistical and welcome remarks before I turn things over to my colleague, Bill Weiss. For those of you who are not familiar with the Stimson Center, we are a Washington, D.C. based think tank dedicated to enhancing global peace and economic prosperity by identifying pragmatic solutions to current and emerging global challenges. Our research agenda includes a broad range of critical security and development issues organized across 4 key themes: protecting people, preserving the planet, promoting security and prosperity, and grand strategy. Our Southeast Asia program has been around for about 15 years, and today's session is hosted by a new initiative of our program called the Southeast Asia Forum, which Bill will tell all of you about very, very briefly in a moment. Before I hand things over to Bill, I just want to give everyone a quick run through of the logistics for the Q&A session. So we are going to have a discussion with the audience today, and I would welcome everybody to submit questions or comments into the Q&A box, which is a pop-up button at the bottom of your screen. Please try to direct your question to one of our panelists today. Otherwise, I will have to take my best guess at who you wanted to answer the question. And depending on the number of questions that we have coming in, I will do my best to ask all of them, but we may have a few that we don't get to. And for those, we will share afterwards with the panelists. So thank you once again for joining us all today. And I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Bill for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and good morning, everyone. On the East Coast, good evening to our audience in the Philippines and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Wherever you are, we're really glad to have you with us for this event on the future of the U.S.-Philippines alliance. As Courtney said, my name is Bill Wise. I chair the Southeast Asia Forum at Stimson. This forum is a new project, as Courtney mentioned. Our mission is to promote, facilitate, and expand the study of Southeast Asia at colleges, universities, and research institutions. But our scope is somewhat broader. We also hope to encourage persons in government, NGOs, and the private sector to focus on Southeast Asia and U.S. relations with the region and its states. Please see our new web pages at the Stimson Center website, www.stimson.org. So this is the 4th Southeast Asia Forum event in our inaugural year, 2020. It's also the 2nd meeting of the Forum's Philippines Roundtable, a partnership with our co-sponsor today, the U.S.-Philippines Society. We are grateful to Henry Howard, member of our Forum Advisory Council and a founding director of the U.S.-Philippines Society, for providing the seed money for the Southeast Asia Forum and the Philippines Roundtable. To discuss the future of this alliance, we have 2 experts well known to those of you who follow U.S.-Philippine affairs. First, Renato Cruz de Castro is a professor in the International Studies Department and Charles Lee Chi Kung Professorial Chair in China Studies at De La Salle University in Manila. Thomas Hubbard served almost 40 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, including 4 years as U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines from 1996 to 2000. He is a founding member of a founding director, I should say, of the U.S. Philippines Society. Today, we'll begin our discussion among the three of us, then we'll invite questions from our audience. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. Well, what is the future of the U.S.-Philippine alliance? Our two countries celebrate 70 years of formal alliance next year. As political, economic, and security realities change in the region and beyond, is this alliance sustainable? Can we do more? To understand the prospects for the future, we need to take the temperature of the relationship as it is today. So we'll start briefly by looking at three issues affecting the alliance: the COVID-19 pandemic, the Philippines Visiting Forces Agreement with the US, and the situation in the South China Sea. I'm going to begin briefly with some questions about the COVID-19 pandemic. The Philippine public health system is having great difficulty in coping with this pandemic. Epidemiologists believe that the Philippines lacks the means to control the pandemic without a vaccine. This may be true for most countries in Southeast Asia. Russia has promised a vaccine deal for the Philippines. China may conceivably make an offer to the Duterte administration, as it has done with Indonesia and other countries in the region. What role should the US play in helping the Philippines manage this crisis? Should the fact of our alliance give the Philippines special standing in US global vaccine distribution plans? That's one immediate question that we would like to address. A second question concerns the Visiting Forces Agreement with the US. In February of this year, President Duterte announced he would terminate the Visiting Forces Agreement in 6 months. But then, in June, he suspended his notice of termination. The VFA, as almost all of you probably know, is the mechanism under which the bilateral security relationship functions. The VFA allows US and Philippines to exercise and train together. Most observers agree. Eliminate the VFA and you have de facto ended the alliance. What then is the future of the VFA? Will President Duterte reinstate his termination notice, or is he reconsidering the wisdom of ending the VFA and thus the US security relationship? What's at stake here for the Philippines and for the US? The third issue of immediate concern is the problem of territorial disputes and Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. What is the state of affairs in the South China Sea? We know China has occupied and militarized numerous islands and non-islands, call them features, including several features claimed by the Philippines. The previous Philippines administration asked the arbitral tribunal established under the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea to support its territorial claims. The Philippines received a favorable ruling from the arbitral panel and in 2016, but the Chinese immediately dismissed the award as not binding on them. Entering office 4 years ago, the Duterte administration did not initially press this claim. Now, the situation is different. As I noted, in June, the Philippines suspended its Visiting Forces Agreement termination order. On July 13th, however, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued a statement reinforcing US policy on the South China Sea, harshly criticizing China and supporting the rule of law and our Southeast Asia partners and allies, who are also claimants in the area. Then in early August, Secretary Pompeo spoke by telephone with Philippine Foreign Secretary Lacson about the change in US policy on maritime claims in the South China Sea, explaining to his counterpart the new US assertiveness. Soon after that, China increased its air and naval activity further north in the South China Sea, and the US responded by imposing sanctions on 24 Chinese companies and individuals who participated in constructing and militarizing artificial islands in the sea. In late August, Foreign Affairs Secretary Locsin told a Philippine-based TV channel, in a bit of a departure from previous administration statements, we need the U.S. presence in Asia. Finally, President Duterte told the UN General Assembly on September 22nd that the Philippines accepted the 2016 arbitral award. He said it is now part of international law, beyond compromise and beyond the reach of passing governments to dilute, diminish, or abandon. The Philippines, he warned, will firmly reject attempts to undermine it. This is strong language indeed, and apparently a major alteration in Philippine national policy. So there are three issues related to the future of the alliance that we like to delve into. But let's begin, Professor, with the question of perceptions. Are the two parties, the Philippines and the U.S., changing their views on the alliance? Is there still a sense that the U.S. and the Philippines may be drifting apart? Or to the contrary, are the peaks and valleys, maybe lately some valleys, of the past few years now accepted as normal for a fundamentally secure U.S.-Philippine relationship in an increasingly multipolar world? What is the Philippine perspective on the alliance today? Professor?
Well, if you talk about the Philippines, you have to look in terms, of course, of President Duterte, who is very much skeptical about the alliance. Even during the start of his term, he basically wanted to pursue an independent foreign policy. If he had it this way in 2016, he could have basically triggered a breakdown in the alliance, but then you have to take into account domestic actors, primarily, of course, the military, who, upon his arrival from Beijing, when he announced in 2016, I wanted separation, he was confronted by the military. So he realized that he could not really push the button. He had to compromise with domestic actors. The military told him the alliance is very important. We get our equipment from the United States, and of course, the military is still very much suspicious of China. So this put President Duterte on the spot, and this basically led, and something I will be discussing, the end of the first crisis in the alliance. This began, of course, in 2016 after his meeting with then President Barack Obama in Laos. You know, that incident there. Then he really was bent on expecting a breakdown, but then he confronted a brick wall. The military, which he also wants to earn its support. Plus, of course, he had to take into account the Department of Foreign Affairs and, of course, the opinion of the vast majority of the Filipinos who are for the alliance. So again, we jumped this year when he wanted the termination of visiting force agreement. Then again, he encountered resistance not only from the military or from the Department of Foreign Affairs. He also encountered opposition from the Philippine Senate. So for the first time, remember in 1991, it was the Philippine Senate that did not concur to the Philippine-American Cooperation Treaty, which of course led to the withdrawal of the bases. Then again, Ambassador Hubbard, remember the resistance coming from the Philippine Senate. But then it made a 180-degree turn last February when they basically told President Duterte, we don't want the termination of the agreement. So you have to take into account these domestic factors that, of course, are bent in ensuring that the alliance remained intact. Plus, of course, they got a boost from an unexpected source, China's aggressive action in the South China Sea. Plus, of course, the fact that China did not deliver the goods or the goodies it promised President Duterte in 2016. When he went to Beijing, and of course, President Xi Jinping promised them $24 billion in economic assistance. It never came. Only about 164 million came. So there's also a sense of, betrayal on the part of the Duterte administration that China did not promise the money it committed under the Belt and Road Initiative to fund the Build program of the Duterte administration. So my point here is that you cannot simply see the Philippines as a monolithic entity. Rather, you have a debate going on. And at this point in time, after, of course, you have a number of incidents, like, for example, what happened on February 17, 2020, just a week after President Duterte announced the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement, you have an incident between a Philippine frigate, the one that was given to us by South Korea, the Conrado Yap, where it encountered a Chinese corvette. And the gun control system was directed against the BRP Conrado Yap. I think this was an eye-opener, not only for the military and the Navy, but for the Duterte administration that, China is really bent on maritime expansion. No amount of appeasement could basically prevent China from pursuing its goal of maritime expansion in the South China Sea. So last August, during an interview with ANC, Secretary Locsin made an announcement. We need the alliance. If you have an incident that will happen between a Philippine Navy ship and, of course, the Chinese Navy, I will call Washington, D.C. This is the first time that the ranking official of the Duterte administration admitted that the alliance is important. Then this follow up by during the confirmation speech of the new AFP Chief of Staff, when he said the armed forces of the Philippines is very much dependent on the United States in terms of military materiel. Of course, you remember at the onset of his term, President Duterte wanted the armed forces of the Philippines to acquire weapons from China and, of course, from Russia. None of them ever happened. Of course, China gave assistance, armed the Marawi siege. It was never used by the armed forces of the Philippines. So you have these domestic factors that are, of course, ensuring that the alliance would remain intact. This probably would ensure the survival of the alliance beyond the Duterte administration. But of course, there will be a question: what will be the form of this alliance, after, of course, you have the presidential election in 2022? So, of course, the current challenge right now is the fact that just in case you might have a change in the administration in the United States during an election year, I think that's the reason why the Duterte administration decided to just suspend the termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement as a sort of a hedge of just in case who would be occupying the White House by January next year and what will be his policy. Remember, the Duterte administration is very sensitive when it comes to its drug war and its human rights record. So at this point in time, the alliance is kind of stable because there's a sort of quid pro quo between the Trump administration, President Trump, who basically turned the other way in looking at what's happening here in terms of the drug wars, the human rights violation. So in a way, it stabilized the alliance. So I end here, and I'm expecting a very dynamic Q&A session later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Ambassador Hubbard, briefly, how is the alliance viewed in Washington? Has the Trump administration's outlook on the alliance changed in the past year, or is this a constant in U.S. policy?
Well, I think we need to separate sort of the Trump administration's attitude towards alliances, President Trump's attitude towards alliances, from its appreciation of the value of the relationship with the Philippines, which of course rests fundamentally on our Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951 as sort of implemented and operationalized by the Visiting Forces Agreement and other accords that we have undertaken. I do think the Trump administration appreciates the fact that we have a friend in the volatile area, not only facing China's aggression in the South China Sea, their very assertive activities, but also a key area in the Trump administration's sort of premier approach to Asia, that is the free and open Indo-Pacific area, and the Philippines obviously sits geographically in a crucial place there. So I think we value the relationship. I think the Trump administration has been rather patient in dealing with the various peaks and valleys, Bill, that you cited in the relationship during its time in office. Duterte and his attitude towards the alliance, his attitude towards the United States has been a challenge, and I think the Trump administration has been more tolerant of, as Renato suggests, with the kind of language that has often come out of the mouth of the Philippine president. I've often described the President Duterte's frequent profanities as the moral equivalent of Trump's Twitter. They do. These are soulmates in some ways, and that period will end. But I'd rather put, I think, the emphasis on the peaks. We have gotten over most of these things. In fact, I think we need to recognize fundamentally that if in all public opinion polls you find that about 75% of the Filipino people support a close relationship with the United States, including the alliance, and about an equal number of the Philippine public is opposed to closer relations, is very sufficient, very suspicious of China. I think that is not only an attitude that we see on the part of the Philippine military, I think, which relies on that relationship, but also the turnaround in the Senate we've seen, I think, reflects public opinion. So it's my hopes that right now we're on a peak. I think we were all very impressed with Duterte's speech at the UN General Assembly, in which he very clearly asserted the Philippine support for the UN Law of the Sea Tribunal decision. Let's hope that the suspension of abrogation of the VFA, in fact, turns out to be an extension of the VFA itself, hopefully into the next administration, and we'll just have to see what happens after our own election.
Just following up on that last point for a moment, Ambassador Hubbard, if the VFA abrogation remains in suspension, does that make it operative, or does suspension mean it is effectively inoperative?
No, I think we consider it operative, and as far as I know, we're proceeding as if it were unchallenged at this point.
I think that's an important point, that both sides perhaps are gaining, you might say, gaining without giving at the moment.
Frankly, I give Bill. You're a former Defense Department employee. We've all been in government. I give the Trump administration some credit for basically tolerating the hiccups in the relationship with Duterte and looking to the long run, which I do think is likely to be a continuance of this relationship.
Yes, it does appear that whatever the view of President Trump on alliances in general, that the United States has cut a small space for the Philippines, and that may be a perhaps exemplar of how important the relationship really is to the U.S. I wanted to go back to one of the points I made earlier and ask Renato, how, if at all, does the COVID-19 pandemic play in this alliance dynamic? Is it influential, or is it a side issue?
It's also important in terms of the fact that the United States actually gave a lot of assistance to the Duterte administration, like in terms of hospital beds, a number of incubators that were given by the United States. And you find this a very interesting incident. You have, of course, Ambassador Sung Kim announcing that the Philippines is getting a number of ventilators. Then a few weeks later, you have President Duterte granting absolute pardon to Corporal Pemberton, which was not expected even by the U.S. Embassy in Manila. Remember that case, the Pemberton case, about a U.S. Marine who got convicted through the BFA? At the time, the U.S. Embassy was just hoping that he would be released on the basis of good conduct in about after serving for about 5 years. They never expected President Duterte to grant him an absolute pardon, which President Duterte took. He took a calculated risk because suddenly you have a lot of domestic opposition against the BFA attacking President Duterte for making that action. So in a way, I think it's sending a signal, like the speech of Secretary Luxin, or speech, the interview of Secretary Luxin, that we are willing, we are ready to keep business as usual, except just in case you have somebody new in the White House, to stop, refrain from publicly attacking this administration for allegations of human rights violations because of the drug war. So signals are being sent clearly. We are comfortable with that space provided to us by the Trump administration. Please don't rock the boat. I don't know if that message will get through after the election, after you have the inauguration.
Renato, is there anything that on the horizon that might stir the status quo, that is from the Philippine side, that might cause the administration either to relent on the visiting forces agreement, to ask more support in the South China Sea, or any other bilateral action that could move the relationship one way or the other?
Well, Chinese action is also another factor. Especially in the light of the pandemic, and there's a perception that China has been using the pandemic to become more assertive in the South China Sea. That's also a factor that the Duterte administration had taken into account when it decided to end the termination of the visiting forces agreement. So Chinese action is a very crucial factor here. I don't know if you've been observing what happened in Manila. The Duterte administration, the government lifted the ban on the exploration for natural gas exploration at the Reed Bank. Of course, some people are saying this is possible because probably it got a signal from China. But recently, statements are coming out that the Chinese were not informed. The Chinese are not party to this, and this might be trying to test whether it will get U.S. support just in case the Philippine government would start again natural gas exploration at the Reed Bank. So you have those messages, those short efforts, signals being sent by the Duterte administration that we're playing this game. At this point in time, we have a problem with China. Probably we could find a quid pro quo with the United States. We get more backing in terms of our dealing with China, and please don't criticize the drug war. So I don't know how will this be taken in Washington.
Bill, could
Yes, Ambassador.
I hope I addressed that.
I hear you and understand what you're saying. Having sort of praised Trump for the the patience of the administration with the ups and downs of the military relationship and the VFA, et cetera. I don't want to suggest that American criticism of the drug war and the human rights violations will go away. Obviously, Congress plays a big role in that. It is a big issue as we seek to sort of widen the relationship, for example, with a free trade agreement. But I do think the Biden administration will probably be less reticent than the Trump administration. President Biden is more likely to, or his senior officials are more likely to speak out on that issue than the Trump administrations have. And I do think one of the things going forward is we're going to have to find some way, if we do have a Biden administration, I think going forward, we're going to have to find a way to sort of insulate that process. I think the words out of President Duterte's mouth as he came into office vis-a-vis the United States, I think were very shocking for all, and perhaps the the Obama administration took umbrage in ways that were not as carefully studied as perhaps. Now we know this is coming. If we have a Biden administration, I think all of us are going to need to work to try to insulate that issue from the overall progress of the alliance.
But just to be clear, a Biden administration would, I assume, be as likely as the Trump administration to value the security aspects of the alliance to ensure that U.S. interests in the South China Sea and the surrounding area are protected.
Yes, I think so. And in fact, whereas Trump has been anti-alliance around the world, the Philippines has been something of an exception. I think Biden will be very pro-alliance, and I think his administration will be looking for ways to expand our cooperation.
Renato, did you want to add anything to this discussion right here, or if you do, please go ahead. Otherwise,
yes, I'll add something.
Questions. Go.
You also have to take into account the role of other U.S. allies that have been very important in ensuring the stability of the U.S.-Philippine security relation. I'm referring to, of course, Japan. Remember, after Duterte really, was really bent on breaking the alliance in October 2016, you have then former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. The capital he visited after Beijing was, of course, Tokyo. And I was in touch with a number of my friends in the Japanese embassy in Washington and also in Manila, and they were telling me that Prime Minister Abe was, telling President Duterte, you just cannot simply drop the United States like a hot potato. Then the following year, Shinzo Abe even went to Davao, just basically convincing President Duterte that, again, our common alliance with the United States matter a lot. So that's the other factor you have to take, that other bilateral allies like Japan and to a certain degree even South Korea are playing an important role in ensuring the stability of the bilateral, the U.S.-Philippine security relations.
Renato, have ASEAN friends also discussed behind the scenes the alliance with the Duterte administration?
I haven't heard any. They're basically hands off. The rule of the rule of thumb in ASEAN, non-interference in domestic affairs. But for Japan, surely for Japan, I've seen how Japanese, specifically former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, went out of this way just to basically try to convince President Duterte getting too close to China is kind of dangerous. Have to ensure that every step you take, you also have to take into account our common alliance with the United States, and to a certain degree, South Korea, providing equipment to the armed forces of the Philippines. Okay,
very good.
Not so much with the other ASEAN countries.
Very good. Courtney, we are. It is our time to move to questions. I see we probably have 2 or 3 more than we're able to answer. So if you can aggregate them, that would be great.
Sure, and I'm actually going to go ahead and start with a couple of questions that can kind of continue the direction that was just discussed in terms of cooperation between the US and the Philippines within the broader context. So we had a couple questions from members of the audience about the Philippines coordinating with other American allies or partners in the region. So specifically, in terms of South China Sea issues, there's a question about, is there interest from the Philippines in working with Vietnam, given the shared challenges in the South China Sea? And we also had a question from a journalist named Manik Mehta asking about the possibility of the Philippines engaging in sort of the Quad Plus discussion. So as we've seen in over the last couple of years, there's sort of an increasing call for like-minded countries through the Quad with the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. So is there interest in the Philippines in engaging with the Quad?
Renato, why don't you start on that question, and perhaps Ambassador Hubbard, you can add anything that you feel is germane. Renato.
Okay, in terms of Vietnam, we have a security partnership with Vietnam. Interestingly, I don't know if you remember, was it in 2008? Yeah, 2018, when President Duterte ordered the armed forces of the Philippines to acquire kilo-class submarines. I bet it caused alarm in Washington, D.C. Definitely caused alarm in Tokyo, because I was in Tokyo during that time. The Japanese were not very happy. It was actually the Vietnamese that convinced, it told the armed forces of the Philippines, don't acquire Russian-made weapons. For us, we're used to this, but you might have a problem. So that's an example of how at least the Vietnamese were able to give, sound advice to the Philippines. In terms of the Quad, the Philippines might adopt the attitude of the ASEAN. The attitude of the ASEAN vis-a-vis Quad is, of course, a matter of concern, because ASEAN still values its centrality in regional security affairs, and it views the Quad as a threat to that centrality. Also, the Quad, from the perspective of ASEAN, is an indication that the United States and the other Quad members are raising the ante in terms of its strategic confrontation with China in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia, something the ASEAN countries do not want to be put, to be entrapped in the middle. So probably in that respect, the Philippines would adopt the ASEAN view that the Quad is something that, we're really very wary with. I hope I addressed those questions.
Ambassador Hubbard?
Well, let me first go back to the earlier issue of the support by Japan and South Korea for the U.S. relationship with the Philippines. I think both Japan and South Korea, somewhat more quietly, have long seen the U.S. relationship with the Philippines as a central element in peace and stability in the region, and therefore in their interest. And the Japanese in particular have tried to support us in many ways, and that has redounded to the benefit of the Philippines. Yeah, the Quad does pose a dilemma, as Renato says, to the to the ASEAN approach to the region. One, they want to be central, and the Quad didn't start with ASEAN; it started all around the periphery. And two, they do see it as perhaps more confrontational with China than they want to be. So it does pose a dilemma. But I think, again, we as Americans should support that ASEAN centrality in their region and help find ways that that ASEAN can support our broader interests without detracting from their own interests.
Courtney?
So moving to a slightly more specific question, there was already some discussion on today's panel about the diversification strategy that the Philippines military forces have taken in terms of acquiring weapons and other equipment. Can you talk about how this move to acquire support and military equipment from other countries is affecting U.S. relation with the armed forces of the Philippines, and is it posing a challenge, or is that welcomed by both sides?
Renato?
In terms of the equipment, the U.S. is still, the United States is still the preferred source of the armed forces of the Philippines, and this was raised during the debate in the Senate regarding the termination of the visiting force agreement. This was raised by no less than Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Teodoro Locsin, and this was adopted by the senator. When we get military equipment from the United States, we got the total package. In terms of support, spare parts support, so on. So this is still the preferred venue. Plus, of course, you have the foreign military sales credit when they could acquire equipment and they have to pay it in the next 30 years. Of course, you have certain acquisitions, like, for example, acquisitions from South Korea. But again, this is also within the framework of the broader alliance. South Korea makes it a point to really give the Philippines a lot of perks when they acquired weapons, like the squadron of F-50 and also the frigates. The Philippines bought 2 frigates from South Korea, and the South Koreans gave them 1 free. So, and again, this is in the light of the relationship that began during the Korean War. And a number of those Korean-made weapons have actually American components. So again, this is still within the framework of the alliance. Of course, also in terms of the equipment that the Japanese are giving to the Philippines. Again, This is within the framework what I would call the links among the spokes, which is of course happening right now. That American allies are also cooperating among themselves. Nothing will come out with the acquisition from Turkey because there's a sanction against Turkey. Definitely the Philippines would not acquire kill-class submarines from Russia. China gave some weapons to the Philippines, assault rifles and squad machine guns during the siege of Marawi. But the armed forces of the Philippines said, we cannot read Chinese and we're used to American-made weapons. So they gave it to the Philippine National Police. So until now, despite efforts to acquire some weapon system from other countries, remember those countries are also American allies, and still the prepared source of weapons is still the United States. Although President Duterte, of course, has a different opinion, but in the end, it's the military that calls the shots.
Courtney?
So we had a couple different questions that I'm going to sort of combine here. So Jed Snyder from the Center for Naval Analysis highlighted that the leadership and staff from the Pacific Fleet and the 7th Fleet would, if asked, highlight that the need for additional ship repair facilities in East and Southeast Asia continues to be an issue of sustaining a U.S. presence in the region. So he had asked about sort of opportunities to improve that in the future. We had another question about the possibility of leasing Clark Air Base to improve forward deployment and access in the region. So can you talk about sort of these access issues in terms of the alliance?
Ambassador Hubbard?
I think if the access issue,
sorry, Renato, please go ahead.
He's muted.
You will need to unmute. Or Courtney, can you unmute him?
I think I can ask him to unmute, but I don't believe I have the capability to unmute him. So why don't we go ahead and let the ambassador start, and then we'll turn back to Renato in a moment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think there's various issues involving access, and I think I'm not sure what Renato would have said, but I think as we approach these things, we have to start from the premise that I see no possibility that the United States will ever have permanent facilities in the Philippines. We now have this enhanced defense cooperation agreement, ETCA, that provides for more regular use of certain Filipino facilities, but I don't think that would be something that could be expanded to embrace leasing Clark and using it as a U.S. facility. And besides, Clark is really quite busy now without a major military presence. I think it is really, really booming, and I think Clark is still available for transits and things like that. But we should be looking in other directions. I do think I'm not sure what exactly the status is right now over the project to replace a former Korean run ship repair facility on Subic Bay, apart from our old naval base, and use that for U.S. military, some U.S. military ship repair under private management. I think that project is going forward, and we all welcome that very much.
Renato?
Yes, in terms of access, commercial access is no problem. Ambassador Hubbard talking about the Hanjin. Hanjin went bankrupt, and I think an Australian-American company took over the facility. So there will be no issue when it comes to commercial. Of course, the problem is, for example, just like what Ambassador Hubbard said, you cannot just lease the whole entire Clark. It says now it's a export processing zone. The place that could, where the United States Navy could have access with on a commercial basis is still Subic Naval Base. But again, I would like to emphasize it should be on a commercial basis.
All right, well, I'm going to combine a couple of additional questions again. We had a few pickups of the discussion of what would happen under a Biden administration in terms of the U.S.-Philippine relationship. So Bob Romwallo had asked about a recent Foreign Affairs Journal article, which had a white paper on the Biden foreign policy, but made no reference to the Spratlys or freedom of navigation. So is that something that you all see continuing to receive attention and priority under a Biden administration if we have one starting next year? And the other question was sort of on the human rights issue that was previously discussed. So I know Ambassador Hubbard had commented on the challenges of maintaining the relationship given the sensitivities surrounding human rights. So is there a way, or do we see any path forward that a Biden administration could hold leaders responsible and accountable for protecting human rights, but still maintain a strong relationship?
Well, support for freedom of navigation operations seems to be a constant among U.S. administrations, a pillar of American global policy in the global commons. Ambassador Hubbard, do you foresee any changes?
No, I think that is very much in the U.S. interest. I think both parties perceive that we need to maintain the freedom of seas in the South China Sea and elsewhere in the region. And I believe we will continue to make that point through these ship passages that demonstrate the open seas. Back to the question. I don't see. I didn't read the article that was referred to in which the South China Sea was not mentioned. But I have no doubt that the South China Sea and the Chinese efforts there will present themselves as an issue for any administration. They have created a difficult situation in terms of their reclamations and sort of semi-militarization of various of the features there. I'm sure the Biden administration, like the previous Obama administration and the Trump administration, will support the concept, support the UN law, the Sea Tribunal's decision on the status of various islands there. And I think that the South China Sea will continue to be an area where part of the overall China challenge that any administration will face. What was the second part of the question?
Human rights.
Human rights. Yes. Again, I think we need to be prepared for the thought that the Biden administration, its support for alliances notwithstanding, as all Democratic administrations, is likely to be more outspoken on the issue of human rights. I do think some of the things that have happened under the Duterte administration will come to the fore as they examine human rights in the world, and will be more outspoken. And again, it shouldn't be beyond our skills as diplomats to find ways to insulate our important strategic relationships from these issues like human rights that are very important in the United States and must be addressed.
At some times in the past, we actually have been rather astute at managing these two sides of foreign policy. Perhaps that will be the case in the future. Courtney, we have about 10 minutes remaining. Do we have questions still?
We have many questions still, so I'm going to continue to try and combine a few of these together. So we have had a couple of people raise questions about Sabah. So can the United States, Japan, or other outside partners have some role in resolving the Philippines' historical claims to Sabah in terms of providing a roadmap for resolving intra-ASEAN territorial disputes and maintaining or creating a unified front to the South China Sea disputes with China? And we had a second question on Sabah, sort of discussing what role that plays in the U.S.-Philippines relationship specifically, and are there a few scenarios that are worth considering?
Professor.
I think it's best for the Philippines and Malaysia to manage that issue within the framework of ASEAN, which of course means managing but never resolving that issue. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I'll settle for that. We don't need the United States to resolve that matter. We're going back to the 1960s. which caused frustration on the part of the Philippines, when the Philippines then was thinking of invoking the Mutual Defense Treaty. And of course, you have the reaction, the response of the United States, which caused a lot of disappointment in Manila. So again, I think it's better resolved by Malaysia and the Philippines, or managed within the framework of ASEAN.
Courtney?
All right, so a few questions about domestic United States policy and perspectives that I think might be best addressed to Ambassador Hubbard. So one is sort of, to what extent are relations with the Philippines now seen through the prism of, or it's seen primarily through the prism of, rivalry with China as compared to sort of the historical ties to the Philippines? And the second is sort of, we've talked a lot about the role of domestic politics in the Philippines influencing the alliance, but what about in the United States? And the specific reference was to the Philippines Human Rights Act that was introduced last month in Congress, which would impose limits on providing assistance to the Philippines armed forces and the police. So can you talk a little bit about how domestic views and politics are impacting the relationship?
Your first question was, the first part of the question, just quickly, could you remind?
Yes, the first part was sort of the extent to which American views of the Philippines are now seen primarily through a rivalry with China rather than as an independent and historical relationship.
Thank you very much. Now, I welcome that question because the original question put to us for this meeting was, what do we think of the future of the U.S. Philippine alliance? I've been involved with it since the early 1980s in one way or another. And I have seen that alliance evolve in important ways and sort of catching up with the issues of the times. Any alliance relationship is only viable so far as the two parties the two parties have mutual respect, and so long as the alliance is based on a common sense of interest and purpose, and those things have changed in different ways throughout the year. Originally, I think the alliance was part of the Cold War. It was seen by many Filipinos when we had the bases there as somehow the Filipinos renting us bases to defend our own interests in the world and our common interest. And that was true to a certain extent. Perhaps too much emphasis was put on the transaction. They're giving us bases so we can promote our interests. Since then, we have re-examined the relationship in a variety of ways. In 1992, when the Philippine Senate decided we should no longer have bases there, and we accepted that agreement, China wasn't a major factor. We still had that Cold War vision. Global terrorism was not yet a major factor. And since those days, both of those issues have very much come to the fore. And we have come through the years, as I noted earlier, to support the Philippines in our combined effort against global terrorism. I think that effort will continue, and we still have rotations of troops to help out in Mindanao and help with that issue. But in recent years, I think the China issue has come to very much come to the fore, and to a very large extent, the rising China and its new assertiveness are being are sort of the driving force in our relationships through the region. And indeed we do. I think one of the main things we're working with the Philippines on is, in fact, the effort to in a way arrest China's expansion in the region, and that's important. But we do have other things like humanitarian issues. Philippines is one of the world's largest victims of natural disasters, and we've helped out a lot on that. So we've got a lot of reasons to continue that alliance, and for that reason, I think we will adapt the alliance going forward. Uh, and I start out with mutual respect. I think in some ways there's been some challenges to that during the Duterte administration, and Trump has actually been fairly tolerant of that. I think going forward, I think recently, as Renato has said, Duterte's been trying to find ways to signal that he would like to be closer with the United States and perhaps closer with the new Trump administration or the next administration. And I think that process will continue. This has been an adaptable alliance. The very unusual thing to have treaty alliances. You've got to remember, of all of the claimants in the South China Sea, Philippines is the only one that has a treaty alliance with us. It's one of, if you look at operational alliances, it's only in the Asian region. It's only the Philippines, Japan, Korea, Australia, where we have this kind of thing. It's something special, and we both ought to, it serves the interests of both countries, and we ought to try to preserve it as these peaks and valleys occur. That's a long-winded response.
Renato, Ambassador Hubbard has essentially said that, if I may take some liberty with your words, Tom, that the right now the alliance rests on common interests in deterring Chinese aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, in counterterrorism, particularly countering ISIS in Southeast Asia, and in a common interest in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Is that enough to carry this alliance into the future? And you need to unmute.
Well, we can also add that we share common values.
Yes.
That, despite the populist element in this government, this is still a liberal democracy. We still have functioning legislature and, of course, judiciary, so forth and so on. I'd have challenge like all other liberal democracies at this point in time, but this is something that we still share. You, of course, have issues regarding human rights, but we still have a very dynamic civil society that is, of course, very vocal against the government action. So this is not yet, a client state of China, given the fact that it's this very vibrant democracy is the one that is basically telling the Duterte administration that, be careful about adopting that appeasement policy vis-a-vis China. And the fact that a majority of the Filipinos still consider the United States as a country that's worth trusting. So again, there's also an element of the importance of our civil society and the fact that every Filipino family has an American relative, what I call the trans-Pacific connections. So it's not just the mutual interest we have, it's the fact that we share common values.
Great. Well,
Right.
very well.
Bill, let me just fully agree
Tom.
with what Renato just said. I
Please.
see it at those points. Again, it rests on our mutual respect, and I think that what Renato just said is part of that. Is we have a great deal of respect between our people, and we have 4 million Filipinos in the ethnic Filipinos in the United States. Most of them citizens.
Well, that is a fitting place to end our conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of our allotted time. I'm sorry we could not get to all of the audience questions, but we're very grateful to the audience for your wonderful participation in this webinar. Thanks also to our expert participants, Professor Renato Cruz de Castro and Ambassador Tom Hubbard. You were terrific, and we really appreciate your sharing your expertise. Thanks also to Courtney Weatherby, our excellent research analyst in the Southeast Asia program at Stimson, for managing the questions. Please join us for future Zoom meetings of the Southeast Asia Forum. We will have 2 in November. Information on these meetings is available at our webpage on the Stimson website. And if you are a student, faculty, or researcher in Southeast Asia affairs while you will find additional information about Southeast Asia that may be of great use in our website. Thank you again to all of you. We look forward to seeing you in the very near future. With that, have a great day and goodbye.
Thank you, Bill.